In this video, we're going to talk about the problem of unaffordable housing prices in big cities. We're going to take a look at rent control, the YIMBY movement, and land value taxes. In a previous video, we talked about how Los Angeles has been affected by unaffordable housing prices, and this is certainly not the only city. One group of researchers looked across several cities in the US and found that in some places, people under 30 spend up to 45% of their income on rent. Hopefully, we can all agree that having to pay almost half your salary in rent is way too much. And unfortunately, the problem seems to be getting even worse. BBC recently wrote an article about this subject in relation to the UK, and here the picture was very clear. Rents are increasing further and further, and wages are struggling to keep up. So rent is already at an unsustainably high level, and the problem is only getting worse. So what can we do to solve this issue? Currently, there are several movements fighting for a solution to this problem. An important one is the YIMBY movement. YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard, and if you haven't heard of them yet, then they are essentially a pro-development movement that fights for more housing at cheaper prices. They also have a subreddit, which I would encourage you to check out if you want to know more about them. The link will be in the description. The more common idea to solve the problem, which most voters support, is rent control. Several different types of rent control exist, with the most common one being that the government sets a limit on how much a landlord can charge in rent. Initially, it sounds like these two movements want the same thing, but in reality this might not be the case. With that question in mind, this video will look at whether or not rent control will help the YIMBY movement in creating more affordable housing, or if these two movements are in fact antagonists to one another. Let's start looking at rent control first. I'll be the first to admit that it looks good on the surface. Limiting how much a landlord can charge in rent seems like a simple way to protect tenants from too high rents. And there's no doubt that rent control certainly has been helpful to some. It has given some tenants the comfort of knowing that they can safely stay in their home without having to worry about rents suddenly becoming unaffordable. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Rent control also has many indirect implications, some of which might not be so obvious at first. And in my opinion, the positive sides of rent control can in no way be justified by how much damage it can actually cause. So with that being said, I do not believe that rent control will help the YIMBY movement in creating more affordable housing. I actually see rent control as an antagonist to the YIMBY movement. So let me first explain what the negative sides of rent control are, and then at the end of the video I will bring up not one, not two, but 3 different solutions for solving the problem with unaffordable housing prices. And by the way, if you disagree with any of my arguments or have another proposal for how to solve the problem of unaffordable housing prices, then I am very open and curious to hear your thoughts, so please feel free to post your ideas in the comment section. So what do economists think about rent control? Well, a survey was conducted among 500 economists, asking them about their view on rent control, and 93% of them agreed that a ceiling on rent reduces the quality and quantity of available housing. And keep in mind that this survey interviewed economists across the entire political spectrum. And how often do you see a scenario like this, where economists ranging from far left to right all agree on the same issue? And furthermore, it is not just theoretical economists who believe rent control to be a harmful law, because when we look at real-world examples, we see that this is actually what rent control does. Higher rent control does indeed lead to reduced quality and quantity of housing. Just take a look at this recent study which took a look at rent control apartments in San Francisco. After analyzing the effects of rent control, the study reached the following conclusion. We find that rent control offered large benefits to impacted tenants during the 1995 to 2012 period, averaging between $3,100 and $5,900 per person each year, with aggregate benefits totaling over $423 million annually. These effects are counterbalanced by landlords reducing supply in response to the introduction of the law. We conclude that this led to a citywide rent increase of 7%, and cause $5 billion of welfare losses to all renters. So as I said previously, rent control does indeed help tenants. In this case, they saved thousands of dollars in rent. However, it only helped those tenants who happen to live in rent-controlled buildings. As the study observed, the landlords had a simple response to rent control, and that was to reduce the supply of available housing. If you set a limit on how much a landlord can charge in rent, you also make it less profitable to build houses. And so naturally fewer houses are being built. The people living in rent-controlled apartments might come out profitable, but the remaining tenants suffer, because rent control has reduced the supply of housing, and the remaining houses that are left on the market have now become more expensive due to a lack of housing. So when all the numbers were included, the unfortunate tenants had to pay a much higher rent. Rent control actually ended up causing a citywide rent increase of 7%. So in reality, rent control only protects those tenants who live in rent-controlled homes. The remaining ones have to settle with lower quality housing and even higher rents. Rent control is usually pictured as a way to protect the weak tenants from the powerful landlord. However, in reality, this is not at all what it does. The reality of rent control is that it protects one group of tenants, but only at the expense of another group of tenants who have to pay for their counterparts' artificially low rent. So if rent control protects one group of tenants from another group of tenants, then who are the people in each group? Rent control is intended to help people who cannot afford market rent. So let's take a look at who ends up living in the rent-controlled units. The reality of rent-controlled apartments is that they are extremely valuable. They allow the tenant to live in a great location with more space than others. Because the apartment is so valuable, the tenant will try his best to hold on to it, since moving away from it would mean paying more money for less. So when the tenant does move out, he will not simply terminate the contract. No, he will of course make sure to pass it on to a family member or a friend. This is a perfect example of nepotism. The only people who are privileged enough to obtain a rent-controlled apartment are the people with the best connections. So instead of going to low-income families whom the policy was intended to help, it only goes to the best connected people, the people with the most resources. It seems that rent control has a bad influence on the market, and it fails to help the people that it was intended to help. But let's wrap back to our original question again. Are rent control and YIMBY antagonists? YIMBYs want more housing density in cities because this allows more people to live there at a lower price. So does rent control cause people to live in smaller apartments or larger ones? It obviously allows people to take up more space than they otherwise would. Here in Copenhagen, it is not uncommon for older people to live in large apartments with plenty room for many more people. Meanwhile, the younger generation has trouble affording rent and live in the smallest possible space. This is because the older people used to live in these apartments with their children, but while the kids grew up and moved out, the parents keep living in the same apartment because it would be more expensive for them to move out. The effect is that the new families who need the large apartments the most are experiencing housing scarcity, while the older generation who chose to stay in their homes are experiencing housing abundance. The American economist Milton Friedman said that one of the greatest mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. And in this case, Milton Friedman is absolutely right. The intention behind rent control and protecting tenants might sound like a good idea, but the results of rent control are that we actually do the very opposite and harm tenants. And do we really want to support an idea just because it sounds good? Especially when the reality is that it does the exact opposite. So at the beginning of this video, I promised you that I would provide 3 different solutions for solving the problem of increasing rents. The first solution is one that the San Francisco study that we previously referred to has suggested. They proposed that some type of renter insurance could be the solution. Explaining their proposal is an entire video topic in itself, so instead I will put a link to the study in the description in case you want to read more about it. A second solution has been proposed by a group of economists. They say that the root cause of the problem is a lack of available housing, and they therefore propose that we loosen up on several of the restrictions that dictates which types of buildings a real estate developer is allowed to build. On this channel, we have long advocated for yet another solution, and that is land value taxes. The reason is simply that land value taxes basically do the exact opposite of rent control. Rent control encourages land to be left idle because it might not be profitable to build something on the land if you can only rent it out for a minimum rent. Land value taxes, on the other hand, does the very opposite and punishes anyone who leaves their land idle. Rent control discourages renovations. If a tenant is already paying the highest rent allowed under a rent control system, the landowner has no incentive to renovate the home because this will just cost him a lot of money, and he cannot be compensated in any way because he is not allowed to increase the rent. With land value taxes, this is the very opposite. Under this kind of system, landowners can make a profit from renovating their homes, and therefore they will of course do so. We have a lot of other videos about land value tax, so if you want to learn more about them, then go check out the rest of our catalog. If you believe that solving these societal problems is important, then I strongly recommend joining the Georgism and YIMBY subreddits. Recently, we have seen a lot of growth in these two movements, and I'm certain that if we all work together, then we can definitely fix these problems. Please also like and subscribe so our videos can reach a larger audience on YouTube. It really helps a lot with bringing new people into the movement. Thanks for watching.